Hello, my name is Benjamin Jurissen and I'm the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Arts and Culture in Education of the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the honor to talk to you today about a matter that I think is of some importance to the further development of arts education, or to the possibilities that arts education has to adapt the challenges of sustainability and sustainable education. Cultural resilience as a responsibility of arts education. This is a question I want to pose today, and I want to think together with you about the scopes and limits of resilience thinking for a pedagogy of cultural sustainability. Now, first, relating to the term cultural sustainability, this is a term that has been around quite a while, but that has seen many important new publications in the recent years. So this is an ongoing discourse that is very interesting also for arts education. As you may see, it's an interdisciplinary discourse that's held. Basically, there are different understandings of cultural sustainability as well as of cultural resilience, by the way. It can mean the sustenance of a culture or cultural identity in itself, for example, in a diaspora situation. And of course, this is a well introduced and makes a lot of sense to use the term in that way. But it may also be connected to sustainability in this sense of a nature-culture interface, of the preservation of the possibilities of living, continuation of life and good life in the sense of the UN and UNESCO sustainability goals, for example. So I would like to talk a bit about this very idea of resilience and cultural resilience that is connected to this kind of cultural sustainability. And as you see, the second yearbook is just about to being printed and to being published. The second yearbook of our UNITWIN network, Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development. And this is about cultural sustainability. So why, you may ask, why propose a concept of resilience when cultural sustainability is just about to begin to be established as a valuable concept and term? And it's important to not think about the resilience thinking as an alternative to sustainability thinking, but as a kind of translation that especially is helpful for educational and pedagogic endeavors. So the concept of resilience is already established in arts education research in a certain meaning, under striking the power of aesthetic practices, for example, towards important personality traits like this and many other studies show how musical activities, for example, helps young refugee adults on psychological acculturation processes and health-related parameters. So we have this kind of research a lot, and this is not what I want to point out today. I want to point out a different understanding, a more broader understanding of resilience that stems from the social sciences, the environmental studies, ethnography, and cultural studies, and also cultural geography. So in this concept of resilience, these discourses about resilience show that resilience is even a much stronger and more powerful concept than the psychological approaches themselves could reveal. Also, it is much more complex than usually recognized. And I'm very sorry, I won't have the time to talk a lot about the theory and the theoretical concept of resilience itself in this very short presentation. So I'd rather like to outline a certain approach to resilience that I think is quite valuable. And amongst the many valuable contributions to the concepts of resilience of the last years, the work of Katrina Brown. So she's a professor of social sciences based at the Environment and Sustainability Institute at Exeter University in the UK. So Katrina Brown's work, I think, is outstandingly helpful for the educational discourses, and I'd like to show you why. So she proposes a concept of resilience that aims to retain identity through change by activating resources in culturally meaningful ways, so that meaningful responses to disruptive events are created on multiple interwoven social levels. And as you may see, retaining identity through change is opposed to conserving identity as is. Activating resources in culturally meaningful ways is opposed to only apply technological means that don't respond to cultural ways of meaning or cultural ontologies, for example, or problem definitions. So that the responses are created on social levels as opposed to only one isolated single individual level. So you see, this is a kind of very interesting and very interconnected concept of resilience that connects to cultural forms of expression and meaning making. So this, of course, is important for us as arts educators. That connects to the fostering and the exploration of the articulation of identity, and that connects to social learning and collective achievements at the same time. And this is what we basically do all the time in arts and cultural education. A bit more generally, a German educational philosopher, also Klaus Malnhar, argues that the purpose of education itself is to contribute to the continuation of a culture. That's a central concern of what we do in education. It's not about schooling people to become useful members of society in the first place. This is just a means of being able to continue a culture as a meaningful way of a good life. So, and this kind of continuation is not a static one. Education, thoroughly understood, is not about conserving traditions. It means to transmit and thereby enable to acquire and appropriate culture. And this is always and basically a transformative process. Back to Katrina Brown. So she opposes the notion of sustainability and the notion of resilience, basically in the way that sustainability has to work towards set goals, especially because it's an administrative and political process, and you have to define set goals in order to agree on set goals in international negotiations. But this kind of logic of process and goal setting is a completely different logic than we have in educational settings. There we also have set goals, or we also set our goals, and we also have processes, but the quality of these processes are vastly different. And much more similar to the process on the left side of this slide. So the processes that Katrina Brown uses, the terms that Katrina Brown uses to characterize resilience in her way. So it's about a balance of identity and change. It's about meaningful articulations of problems, culturally meaningful articulations of what is a problem. What problems do we face and do we have to work upon? It's about the activation of cultural resources for this kind of change, as we do in transformative learning processes. The graceful ways of adaptation and interventions, and reaching new balances of identity and change. And as you may see, also the complexity, the sheer complexity and interwovenness of the 169 agenda targets of the 2030 agenda makes it really demands not only to teach towards single targets and goals, but to understand the interrelatedness, the integratedness, and the indivisibleness of these goals. And this demands a pedagogy or an education that strives to achieve an attitude of change, and not so much a static knowledge about things. So if we all, which is quite important, but if we all only would teach, for example, how to save a bit of water in our everyday life, but not how the commodification of water resources is connected to the global conflicts of the future, and how buying bottled waters certain bottled waters may be just fueling this process, and what can be done about this. So if we wouldn't teach in this kind of attitude oriented way, we would fail the integratedness and interconnectedness of the agenda target. I would say that a pedagogy of cultural resilience works towards those goals by activating cultural resources within a framework of transformative learning. So now for some examples. I chose to discuss particularly the resilience thinking model of Katarina Brown to some extent because she derives a model of 3 core elements of resistance from her analysis of many ethnographic case studies. The following examples shall demonstrate how these pillars of resilience respond to aesthetic and artistic practices and thus might provide a valuable orientation for an arts education that focuses on resilience and sustainability. So let's start with rootedness. Rootedness, as Katrina Brown writes, a quote, is about place, identity and belonging, and it might act in different ways to both constrain and support capacities to adapt and to transform. And there are different aspects to rootedness. It's social. There is a social rootedness that has to do with equity and health and a sense of community. There's an economic rootedness, so a local economy where people contribute to self-sufficiency and to vibrant local economies. And there's an environmental rootedness that has to do that people are connected to the nature and to natural resources. And this is only the case if they have access and are able to control these resources. Arts education can be directed in such way that equity is performed and thus claimed by means of appropriating an environment. With appropriation, I mean here the double sense of learning about something, as in the appropriation theory of learning by Vygotsky and others, and of claiming something as a common matter, as a common cause that must not be exploited and commodified. Appropriation and appreciation specifically characterize aesthetic learning processes. And we also have to think about diversity and displacement issues, of course, with relation to rootedness. If we think about rootedness, this must include the people that more often than not are denied appropriation because they themselves are considered inappropriate by an established regime of othering. So the people that are considered inappropriate, that are being told that this place is not their place, these people have to be included in an inclusive and sustainable kind of arts education, of course. So this aspects of appropriation, I think there's a lot to talk about this, and I won't have the time, but I like to give an example of rootedness from a huge European study, Rescue Citizens' Resilience in Times of Crisis, where a colleague of mine, Aleida Bosch, participated. And they show in this, I won't have the time to talk much about this, but they made many interviews with people in precarious situations, and they let them take photographs and give the photographs of their interiors to them. And for example, this is a photograph of a house that is in a flooded area regularly. Every few years the house is flooded, and what we see is underwater here. And what they have in their interior is these kind of things that are related to water. So we have a kind of rusty object or rusty can, and we have shells, and we have pebbles that have been formed by the water. And to quote the author's Bosch and Prometa quotation, knowing that this house is always threatened by floods, this symbolism seems particularly noteworthy as a kind of aesthetic resilience that contrasts the traces of beauty produced by the water with the danger. And so we see how these 3 aspects of resistance, rootedness, and resourcefulness act together in this example. Resistance as reinterpreting the notion and the meaning of water against its occasional hostility, not to let the hostility of water dictate how you perceive the water. Rootedness as a sense of place, as being settled economically, socially, and culturally, and wanting to stay in a beloved area. Resourcefulness as being able to use photography and interior design to aesthetically articulate local connectedness, and probably also a kind of transcendence, if not spirituality, as these arrangements are in itself somewhat opaque and enigmatic. Next point would be resourcefulness. So resourcefulness, as Katrina Brown defines, is about linking pre-existing assets and capacity within a community or associated within a place to external streams of resources and making sure that these are used effectively. So this has a lot to do with innovation, quotation end, with social learning, social capital, and networking also. With regard to the virtues of artistic work and research, resourcefulness is about creativity, I would add, and about an ability to make and craft with restricted local resources, to redefine resources and the meanings, and to discover surprising and interesting new connections, building up new social and social material networks. And the capacity of arts education thus lies in its ability to enable and foster a habit of connecting the symbolic and the material, of form and meaning in ever new ways. So to give an example, I chose an example of Kerry Watson in the wonderful book of Steinbock, Even de Falk, about art and activism in the age of systemic crisis, aesthetic resilience. And this is a very serious example about resourcefulness as curatorial activism that is situated around the happenings of the Pulse, that was a gay bar and a dance club in Orlando in Florida, and that was the site of one of the worst mass shootings by a single gunman in US history, and one of the deadliest also, with nearly 50 people killed and over 50 people injured. And Kerry Watson shows how an exhibition is being made that collects photo essays, first-person narratives, portraits of survivors, that illustrates the memorial tattoos that survivors have on their skin after Pulse as a means to remember their friends and mark the bodies. Their bodies with visible signs of solidarity, and these people were there in the exhibition. So it is the gathering together and the assemblage of this social material constellation in order to set meanings and to visibly and publicly communicate the resistance against hate crimes, the rootedness in a social and culturally way, and the resourcefulness by showing that one is able to activate the people and these objects and to arrange this in a curatorial context that contributes to solidarity and change, and that takes a publicly visible stance also. So this, I think, is a very, very interesting example for resistance. And last not least, for resourcefulness, last not least, resistance. And this is something that usually is seen as something that's in an abstract way against something, but this is not what's meant here. Resistance, as Katarina Brown sees this, I quote again, is a potential site for change and the means through which individuals change social processes and structures and build alternatives. So it's more about an activating resistance than just being against something. And with regard to aesthetics, the French philosopher Jacques Rancière understands resistance as an attitude of dissensus. Dissensus means not to take things for granted, not to stay within the given regime of perception and the accepted regime of perception and sense-making. The emergence of an aesthetic politics of the arts marks the power of arts to radically change this very order of perception that dictates the ways we see the world in our everyday life, and to contribute to this kind of change. And of course, arts education can help to participate in this power and to cultivate a habit of seeing that establishes impossible subjects that weren't there beforehand. Such, for example, as the following example shows, as the planet, the Earth as a subject and not as an object of technical and industrial exploitation. So this is an example, and I won't have too much time to talk about this, of the exhibition Critical Zone of the Karlsruhe Center of Arts and Media, the ZKM, and they have this hybrid exhibition which is highly recommended about critical zones. And critical zones is this very small zone on the surface of our planet that we are able to exist in. And they have a lot of art processes and artworks gathered together in this exhibition. And I'd like to point towards this, just to choose one example, this project, Atmospheric Forest, that is a 3D interactive movie that it's gathered from data. So this, what we see here, is a visualization not of trees in itself, but of the volatile emissions, the fragrances that are emitted from the trees and from the resin pressure in pine trees during a growing season. And this kind of emission is connected to global warming. So what we see here is what we would smell if we would be in a forest, so to say, the kind of fragrance, sweating of a forest that is under the pressure of global warming. And so what we see here is something that that aestheticizes, of course, makes aesthetic, builds aesthetic bridges of digital data to our modes of perception and to our emotionality also. So we can explore this kind of situation that affects our nature. And this, I would say, connects to what Jennifer Gabrus called becoming planetary. So if we think about these three pillars or elements of resilience as inseparable Borromean rings, so these rings, you can, each one is dependent on the other two in order to connect together, then we might understand how they connect to what I would say are core virtues of arts education. And these core virtues are connecting to heritage and negotiating heritage, to encouraging creativity and articulation, and to fostering aesthetic deliberation and empowerment. Resilience thinking, I would say, leads to an art education that cultivates in between these rings, so to say, identities that are not fixated but rooted, culturally as well as materially, earthly and economically as well, and thus are open to change by their own means. It leads to a notion of change that withstands or resists neoliberal commodification and leveling of cultural resources and values. And it leads to a sense of collectivity that understands the diversity of heritages as a common cause, a common thing, and a common source of common action. Thank you for your attention.